It was a quiet evening in Los Angeles, the kind that made the city look less like a hub of fame and more like a fading memory. The golden glow of dusk kissed the tops of the sycamores and washed over the rooftops like an old film reel left playing too long. Inside a modest house tucked away in the Hollywood Hills, Keanu Reeves sat by the window with a mug of tea untouched in his hands. The house wasn't grand, not by celebrity standards, but it carried something far more precious: peace. He had spent the day alone, as he often did now, his presence as soft as the classical piano music humming gently from the vintage player in the corner. The room was dim, lit only by the waning sunlight filtering through linen curtains, casting long shadows that stretched like silent ghosts on the walls. In the stillness, he glanced at a framed photo on the table beside him. A candid shot from years ago, laughter frozen in time, Sandra Bullock resting her head on his shoulder, both of them unguarded, unbothered, free. His lips curved into a small smile, but there was pain behind it, too, the kind that only comes from missing someone you never really let go of. Sandra had always been more than a friend to him, though neither of them had ever crossed that invisible line. Maybe they were scared to ruin what they had. Maybe the timing was never right. But now, years later, with life having carved its lines into their faces and softened their ambition into reflection, Keanu couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if either of them had spoken their truth. He sipped the now lukewarm tea, his eyes still on that photo, and remembered the last time they were together on a set. It had been 5 years ago. No cameras, no rehearsals, just a simple dinner at her place, candles flickering between them, and the comfortable silence only two old souls could share. That night she'd made her famous chicken piccata, served it with laughter and red wine, and as they'd washed the dishes together like two people who'd known each other in another lifetime, he'd felt the words rise up in him. But he never said them, and neither did she. Meanwhile, across town, Sandra Bullock was also sitting alone, her arms wrapped around her knees on the floor of her sunroom, watching the last light disappear behind the mountains. She looked beautiful in the kind of way that Hollywood didn't understand, bare-faced, heart bared, her soul radiating in the stillness. The world had seen her as a star, a powerhouse, a woman of charm and strength. But the world didn't see this version, the one that missed a man whose silence spoke more poetry than most could ever write. She hadn't spoken to Keanu in almost a year. Life had pulled them in different directions again, as it always did, but it never pulled her heart away from him. There were so many times she drafted messages, half-composed emails, even voice memos she never sent. What would she say anyway? That she missed him, that the world felt too loud without his calm, that in rooms full of people she looked for the only soul who never asked anything of her except that she just be Sandra. The silence between them wasn't the cold kind. It was the kind that waited, like an unfinished sentence or an unsent letter, or that moment just before someone says, "I love you," but stops. In their hearts they had always spoken to each other, in thoughts, in old songs, in movie quotes that only they found funny. But now something deeper stirred inside her, something that whispered that time wasn't infinite anymore. Life had taken too much already, her parents, her partner, years lost to grief and resilience. She didn't want to lose this too, not him, not the soft, quiet bond they'd built without ever calling it love. So she did something she hadn't done in a while. She picked up her phone and opened her camera roll. There, nestled between blurry selfies with her kids and photos of her dogs, was a video she had forgotten about. A behind-the-scenes clip from a press junket they did years ago. Keanu laughing so hard he cried, his hand brushing hers as he leaned in to whisper a joke only meant for her. Watching it again, tears filled her eyes, not out of sadness but out of the pure ache of remembrance. And without thinking, without editing, she pressed forward and sent it to him with no caption. Just sent it. Keanu's phone buzzed softly on the table beside the photo. He looked at it with a touch of hesitation. He didn't get many personal messages these days. When he saw her name, his breath caught. Slowly, reverently, he opened the message and watched. As the screen lit up with her laughter and his own mirrored joy from years ago, something in him cracked open. He let out a small, breathy laugh, almost a gasp, and for the first time in a long while, his eyes filled with tears that he didn't blink away. He picked up his phone, hands trembling slightly, and pressed record. "I'd forgotten about this," he said in his gentle voice, his eyes still wet. "But I remember exactly how I felt in that moment, like the world had stopped and only you and I were real." He paused, then added quietly, "Thank you for sending this. I needed it more than you know." He didn't overthink it. He didn't erase and redo. He sent it back, raw and real. When Sandra received the video, she didn't move for several minutes. She just stared at the screen, at his face, his voice, his truth. And when she finally did move, it wasn't to reply. It was to stand up, walk over to her bookshelf, and pull out an old notebook, one she'd filled with half-poems, travel thoughts, and pieces of letters never mailed. She flipped to a page written on a rainy day in Paris. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were still legible. Somewhere between silence and stardom, we forgot to name what this was, but I know I've always known. Her fingers brushed the page like it was a memory made of skin. She snapped a picture of it, sent it to him with just one line, "Still true." And that was it. No explanation, no pressure, just truth. That night, neither of them slept. Not out of restlessness, but out of something deeper, an awakening. As if the soul had finally shifted and aligned. As if the years of missed chances, near confessions, and quiet yearning were leading here to this slow, delicate unfolding of something sacred. The next morning, as light broke through the city haze, Keanu Reeves stood outside her gate. He hadn't called, he hadn't texted, he just came. Because sometimes, when the moment finally arrives, words become unnecessary. Sandra stepped out barefoot, her sweater hanging loosely off one shoulder, her eyes already glistening with unshed tears. Their eyes met, and for a long moment they didn't move. Then she walked forward and he opened his arms, and they stood there in the middle of the walkway, two hearts finally admitting in silence what words had failed to say for decades. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no declarations. It was just a hug, a long, quiet, knowing hug. But in that embrace, the world fell away and something eternal whispered through the wind. The kind of moment that didn't need witnesses, and yet, if it had been seen, it would have broken millions. The morning after their silent embrace felt different. It was the kind of morning that moved gently, as if the universe itself didn't want to disturb what had just begun to bloom. The Lowe's angel's sun spilled through Sandra's kitchen windows like golden silk, catching the edges of her hair as she poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, the same ones they had used all those years ago during that candlelit dinner. Everything felt achingly familiar. The light, the scent of cinnamon rolls warming in the oven. The way Keanu sat at her table, elbows resting on the wood, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the grain as if it held answers. There were no cameras, no agents, no entourage, just two people who had spent decades orbiting each other's lives like twin stars too cautious to collide. But now something in the air felt unshackled, like time had finally loosened its grip. They didn't rush to speak. They let silence do what it did best between them, hold space for the things too big to name. Sandra watched him from across the counter, the way his brow furrowed gently in thought, how his eyes carried both oceans and scars. She remembered once, long ago on the set of Speed, how she caught him staring at the sunrise between takes. When she asked what he was thinking, he said, "That I wish I could bottle this moment and drink it when life gets too loud." She hadn't understood it then, not fully, but she did now. Because this quiet this morning, this man, was one of those bottled moments, uncorked after years of being forgotten on a shelf labeled maybe. She placed the mug in front of him and sat down, her fingers brushing his for a breath of a second longer than necessary. He looked up at her and their eyes held again. So many years, so many red carpets, premieres, interviews, always just beside one another, never quite touching what lay underneath. Until now. They talked slowly, softly, not about the industry or upcoming roles or tabloid nonsense. They talked about grief, about the people they'd lost, about the way loneliness had changed shape as they aged, not a sharp pain anymore, but a dull echo in the rooms they lived in. Keanu spoke of his sister's battle with leukemia, of watching someone he loved slowly disappear, and how helplessness became a second skin. Sandra opened up about the adoption of her children, about the invisible judgment that followed her as a single mother, about the strength it took to smile for cameras when all she wanted was to scream into her pillow. They weren't trying to impress each other. They were just being unmasked, and in a world of performance, that was the rarest gift of all. At one point, Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black notebook worn at the edges. He handed it to her without a word. Inside were pages of sketches, faces, hands, flowers, fragments of dreams. But on one page, tucked between a drawing of a mountain range and a quote scribbled in his handwriting, "Some people arrive and make such a beautiful impact, you can barely remember what life was like without them," was a sketch of her, not glamorous, not posed, just Sandra. Sitting in a chair, barefoot, reading a script, her hair tied up, laughter sketched into the lines of her mouth. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. She traced the outline with her thumb, overcome by a warmth that rose from somewhere too deep to describe. When she looked up, her voice trembled. "You kept this?" Keanu nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never stopped." The hours passed without notice. Afternoon crept in like a soft sigh. They took a walk through her garden, their fingers occasionally brushing as they strolled along the stepping stones she'd laid herself. The air was thick with unspoken memories, how she once called him at 2 a.m. because her dog was sick, and he drove across town just to sit on the floor and keep her company. How he once missed a film festival because her son had a fever and she needed someone to talk to. They had been each other's quiet emergency contact for years without ever saying it aloud. Not lovers, not merely friends, something in between, something language fails to capture. And now, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of rose and amber, Keanu stopped walking. He turned to her with a strange kind of stillness in his expression, like a man about to jump but unsure if the ground will catch him. "Sandra," he began, his voice rough around the edges, "do you ever feel like we missed something?" She knew what he meant. Her chest tightened, not with fear but with the weight of recognition. "All the time," she replied. There it was, truth, unvarnished and vulnerable, standing between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. She stepped closer, their bodies just inches apart. "But maybe," she added, "we didn't miss it. Maybe we just weren't ready until now." Keanu's eyes searched hers as if trying to find confirmation that it wasn't too late. And in that moment the world didn't break. It paused, held its breath. And for the first time in their long, beautiful story of almosts and maybes, Sandra reached out and gently touched his cheek. A small gesture, but one that said everything. They didn't kiss, not yet. The moment wasn't about that. It was about the return to something they had both carried silently for years, a garden of what-ifs finally blooming under the light of what now. They sat on her porch that evening, wrapped in shared silence, sipping tea again like they did at the start of the day. As the stars blinked awake above them, Sandra whispered, "Do you think people would understand?" Keanu smiled gently, that quiet smile that always said more than 1,000 words. "Maybe not, but they'd feel it. The real ones always do." She leaned her head on his shoulder then, and he tilted his head to rest on hers. No words followed, just that small sacred moment between two souls who had wandered long, lost in noise, only to find that the heart remembers what the world forgets. And in homes across the world, fans would one day watch the footage, simple, grainy, captured accidentally by a neighbor's security cam or a distant drone, of Keanu and Sandra on that porch beneath that sky, leaning into each other like they were finally home. It would go viral. Millions would pause, hearts would break, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of witnessing something real, something rare. Two people finding their way back not because of timing or fame, but because they never stopped carrying each other in the quiet places. The moment would travel through timelines and headlines. But for Keanu and Sandra, it wasn't about the world watching. It was about finally watching each other, fully, honestly, and knowing the time had come to turn the page. It had been 3 days since that morning on Sandra's porch, 3 quiet, unhurried days that moved like pages from a forgotten novel, delicate and unspoiled. The world outside still spun with its usual noise, press releases, red carpets, fast headlines, empty interviews. But inside Sandra's home, the clock moved differently. There was no rush to name what they had rediscovered, no desperate need to define the moment. Keanu stayed, not as a guest, but as a presence that fit so naturally into the walls that even her dogs had stopped barking at the creak of his footsteps. He brewed the morning coffee now. She made the evening tea, and somewhere between those cups a rhythm emerged, unspoken but mutual. It was a kind of intimacy that didn't need the punctuation of romance to be real, because it was deeper than love, or maybe just quieter. Something only people with shared wounds could build, a home inside each other. On the 4th night, rain came, unusual for LA, but welcome. They didn't speak much that evening. They just sat by the window, the soft tap of water against glass echoing like a lullaby over the wood floors. Keanu leaned back on the old leather armchair, a thick book in his lap, though his eyes weren't reading. Sandra was curled up on the couch, an old hoodie swallowing her frame, watching him more than the storm. She noticed how time had brushed through his hair like a patient painter. Silver strands now framed his temples. But what held her more was his stillness, the kind of stillness that comforted rather than bored. In a world obsessed with action, Keanu brought pause, and in that pause she felt something shift, not in the air but in her chest. A kind of knowing. A certainty that this, whatever this was no longer a maybe. It had become a choice, and choices demanded courage. "Do you remember Tokyo?" she asked suddenly, her voice low, fragile. He looked at her slowly, a smile ghosting the edge of his lips. Of course he remembered. A junket tour 15 years ago. They'd had one night off between events. They'd wandered the neon-lit streets like kids with no destination, laughing too loud, eating street food from back alleys, ducking paparazzi in a borrowed hoodie and cap. At some point they had found a small ramen shop open past midnight. No tourists, no glitz, just quiet locals and soft jazz playing in the corner. They had talked for hours there about nothing and everything. She had told him about her fear of growing older alone. He had confessed he sometimes forgot how to feel joy without guilt. When the shop closed, they had walked back to the hotel in silence, their hands almost brushing but never meeting. "I think I loved you then," she said now, her eyes not leaving the window. Keanu didn't move, not at first. He didn't flinch or laugh it off. He just watched her, his heart thundering in a way that felt foreign, like he was a young man again with a full life ahead. Slowly, he set the book down and rose, crossed the small space between them with a calmness that betrayed none of the war inside his chest. He knelt down in front of her, his hands resting gently on her knees, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then I wish I had told you that I did too," he whispered. "I just didn't think I was enough. You always shone so bright, and I was just trying to survive my shadows." Sandra reached for his hands then, hands that had held the weight of tragedy, of solitude, of decades of loss, and placed them over her heart. "You don't have to shine," she said. "You just have to stay." The kiss, when it came, was not dramatic. It didn't swell with music or need an audience. It was soft, hesitant, the kind of kiss that felt like a promise between old friends who had seen too much and yet still believed in beginnings. It didn't demand anything. It didn't rush. It lingered like a sigh that had been held for years and finally exhaled. After, they stayed wrapped in each other's arms for a long time. No one spoke. The rain had stopped, but inside the house, something sacred was still falling. By morning, the world began knocking again. Their teams had called, press obligations, appearances, contracts waiting to be signed, but everything felt smaller now. Sandra walked into the kitchen, scrolling through her messages with mild detachment. Her publicist wanted confirmation about a film she hadn't even decided to accept. Her manager had questions about an interview. She put the phone down without replying. Keanu, meanwhile, sat at the table with his phone buzzing every few minutes. A studio wanted to fly him to New York. Another production was offering a project that looked perfect on paper. But for once, he didn't feel the urgency to chase. He had chased for years, and now he wanted to stay still, even if just for a while longer. Later that afternoon, they drove together to Santa Monica. The beach was mostly empty, the waves unusually calm. They walked barefoot on the cold sand, each step pushing their history deeper into the earth. "People are going to talk," she said, breaking the silence, her hair blowing wildly around her face. "They always do," he replied, looking out at the endless blue. "But for once, let them talk." She looked at him, this man who had known grief like a language, who had never tried to be anything other than kind, and felt something inside her settle. "Promise me something," she said. "If this us gets loud, if the world makes it ugly, we go quiet again, we protect it." Keanu nodded and without words took her hand. Not for the cameras, not for the fans, but for himself, for her, for them. What they didn't know was that a passerby, some retired tourist with an old DSLR, had captured that moment on the sand. A wide shot, far away, blurry even, but raw, real. And later that week, when the photo leaked online, no context, no gossip, just two silhouettes walking hand in hand against the vastness of the sea, the internet didn't explode with scandal. It broke with silence, because some images didn't need explanation. Some love stories didn't need confirmation. The world didn't need to be told they were finally together. The world felt it, like an ache, like poetry, like closure. Back in her home that evening, Keanu sat on the floor with her kids, building a model train. Sandra watched from the doorway unseen. And something inside her swelled, a feeling of rightness she hadn't tasted in years. Not excitement, not infatuation, but peace, the rare kind. The kind people spent lifetimes chasing. She stepped into the room, sat beside them, and joined without a word. And in that small living room, among plastic tracks and giggles and soft jazz playing on vinyl, a new kind of love was born. Not the one from films, but the one that lasts. And for Sandra and Keanu, that was enough, for now. The following week unfolded like a quiet symphony, gentle, slow, full of notes unspoken yet understood. Inside Sandra's home, mornings began with shared silence and warm glances exchanged across the breakfast table, like seasoned dancers finding rhythm again after years apart. Keanu had found himself in a kind of stillness he hadn't known he'd needed. Not the silence of loneliness, but the peaceful hush of being seen, of being held, not physically, but in the small ways that made all the difference. Sandra, too, found herself returning to parts of her spirit she hadn't visited in years. The part that once believed in softness without suspicion, in love without armor. She watched Keanu move through her world with quiet reverence, how he offered to take the trash out, how he loaded the dishwasher without being asked, how he listened to her kids talk about school as if their stories were red carpet worthy. These gestures didn't scream romance to the world, but to her they meant everything. One evening, as the sky turned the color of old peach and the air smelled faintly of coming rain, Keanu stood at the piano in her living room, softly pressing keys he hadn't touched in years. It was an upright, old, and a little out of tune, but it had soul in its wood, stories in its hammers. Sandra walked in just as his fingers moved through the melody of something half-remembered, half-made up. She leaned against the doorway and said nothing. She didn't need to. He knew she was there just as he always knew when she was near. The music slowed, then stopped. "I used to play," he said without looking at her, "but after my daughter, after Jennifer, I just couldn't anymore." His voice cracked gently on her name. It wasn't often Keanu spoke about the tragedies that had carved through him like rivers shaping stone. But tonight, the air was tender enough to hold his pain without judgment. Sandra crossed the room and sat beside him on the piano bench. She didn't say sorry, she didn't try to fix it. She simply placed her hand on his and let it rest there, warm and steady. "You don't have to play for the world," she said quietly. "Just play for the parts of you that still need to be heard." Keanu turned to her then, his eyes glistening, and nodded. He didn't play again that night, but he would, soon, and when he did, it would not be for an audience, it would be for healing. The next day brought a shift neither of them had anticipated. Sandra received a call from a charity foundation she had quietly supported for years, a school in New Orleans where she had funded libraries and scholarships. They were holding a small event, something low-key, a fundraiser more about connection than publicity. They wanted her to speak. She had almost declined. She hadn't stood in front of a crowd in over a year, not since a particularly cruel tabloid story made her retreat from the spotlight. But now, with Keanu nearby, she felt something different. Not the pressure to perform, but the strength to stand. "Come with me," she asked him later that night, her voice unsure. "Not for the press, just be there." He didn't even hesitate. "Of course." They flew to New Orleans quietly, avoiding the noise. No handlers, no press releases, just two people walking through airports like shadows, unnoticed. The event was held at a community hall that smelled like old books and hope. Children ran around in uniforms a size too big. Volunteers buzzed in and out with trays of lemonade and donated food. Sandra's speech was simple. She didn't talk about movies or fame. She talked about kindness, about second chances, about the strength in vulnerability. Keanu stood in the back, his hands in his pockets, watching her with a softness that didn't need to be hidden. And when she spoke about grief, how it had shaped her, how it had humbled her, he saw a room full of people hold their breath, not because she was famous, but because she was human. After the event, a little girl walked up to Sandra with a drawing in her hand. It was a crayon sketch of two people standing under a tree holding hands. "This is you and the man who was watching you talk," the girl said shyly. "He looked like he was proud." Sandra knelt down, tears welling up. "He is," she whispered. And that night, back in the quiet hotel room overlooking the Mississippi River, she gave Keanu the drawing. He placed it in his notebook carefully, as if it were a sacred thing. "You have no idea what you gave them today," he told her. "You gave them your heart." Sandra smiled through tired eyes. "You gave it back to me," she replied. The next morning brought headlines they hadn't planned. A blurry photo of them walking hand in hand to the car. A fan video of Keanu hugging a janitor at the event. Someone had posted the drawing online with a caption, "When your heart finally meets its home." The internet didn't gossip, it wept, quietly, collectively. The comment sections weren't filled with speculation, but with gratitude. People wrote things like, "This gives me hope," and "I've always known there was something sacred between them." It was, perhaps, the only time fame didn't twist a story, but let it breathe. Back in LA, things started to move again. Studios called, talk shows sent offers, interviewers wanted exclusives, but neither Sandra nor Keanu rushed to respond. They weren't hiding, but they weren't performing either. They were protecting something fragile. And when the world finally got a glimpse of them again, days later at a charity gala, they didn't walk the red carpet separately. They walked side by side. No announcement, no hand-holding for headlines, just presence, just truth. Inside the gala, as photographers buzzed and lights flashed, Sandra leaned in and whispered, "Do you think we'll make it through this?" Keanu looked at her unwavering. "We've already survived everything else. This is the easy part." And for a brief second, the world faded, the cameras, the chaos, the past. All of it dissolved into the moment where two souls found each other again. Not as co-stars, not as celebrities, but as two people who had finally said yes to the story that had been writing itself quietly for decades. In the weeks that followed their public appearance, the world shifted, but not in the noisy, chaotic way Hollywood often moved. This shift was quieter, more reverent. Fans didn't demand answers. They simply watched, supported, and embraced what they had always quietly rooted for, the truth behind the eyes of two of the industry's most beloved souls. Paparazzi tried, of course. They lingered at street corners, hovered outside coffee shops, but neither Keanu nor Sandra gave them the show they wanted. There were no overly staged kisses, no rehearsed joint interviews. Just glimpses of him holding her hand during a quiet dinner in a corner cafe, of her resting her head on his shoulder while waiting for a cab. And it was enough. The world didn't need drama, it needed sincerity. And between Keanu and Sandra, sincerity was never in short supply. But fame is rarely gentle, even when love is. One morning, Sandra's team received a call from a major magazine offering the cover story of the year. The love that took 25 years to begin. The offer came with a photo shoot, a six-figure payout, and the chance to finally own the narrative. Her manager called her, voice buzzing with excitement, but all Sandra felt was a slow ache. She sat at the edge of her bed that afternoon, phone on speaker, listening to people talk about her love like it was a marketing campaign. She looked over at Keanu, who had just come back from a quiet walk with her son. He smiled softly as he entered, holding a bag of oranges from the farmer's market, completely unaware of the conversation. She muted the call and whispered, "Do you want the world to know like that?" Keanu's brow furrowed, and then he shook his head. "I want the world to feel it, not be sold it." And that was the end of it. She turned off the phone, much to her manager's horror, and curled up next to him on the couch, the sound of his heartbeat a far better story than any headline could tell. But there are always ripples in still water. A gossip blog posted a headline 2 days later. Sandra walks away from multi-million deal for Keanu. Is it love or regret? The article was cruel, speculating on past relationships, dragging up old griefs, hinting at emotional instability. The comments turned vicious in hours. Strangers dissected their every movement. Pundits questioned if she was sacrificing her career for a man who never married. She didn't cry, not at first. But that night, after the kids were asleep and the house had gone still, she sat alone on the back porch and stared at the stars until her eyes blurred. Keanu found her like that, wrapped in a blanket, her face tilted to the sky, quiet tears streaking down cheeks she hadn't even realized were wet. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside her, pulling the blanket over both of them, and took her hand. "I'm scared," she finally whispered. "Not of us, but of everything outside of us, the noise, the knives." Keanu nodded. "I know," he said softly, "but we've walked through fire before, separately. This time we're walking together." She turned to him, eyes searching his face. "And if it burns us," he looked back, steady and calm, "then let it, because I would rather be burned standing beside you than safe in a life without you." It was the kind of answer that silenced the storm. She leaned into his chest, listening to the slow, patient rhythm of his breath. And in that stillness, her fear didn't vanish, but it softened. It bowed to love, and that was enough. The next morning, Sandra opened her inbox to find a message from someone unexpected, an old friend from her early days in Hollywood. Not a celebrity, just a crew member from a long-forgotten film. The message was short. "I saw you on the beach with him. I saw the photo. I just want to say thank you for reminding us that real love still exists." It was a small moment, but it mattered. She replied with a simple, "Thank you, we're trying to protect something rare." She showed the message to Keanu, and for the first time in days they both laughed, soft and pure and unburdened. "Maybe we're not alone in this," she said. He nodded. "Maybe we never were." A few days later, they returned to New Orleans, not for press, not for public image, but because it had become a kind of sanctuary for them. The little school Sandra had helped build was holding a spring recital. They sat in the back row, unrecognized by most, surrounded by folding chairs and proud parents. When the children sang, Sandra reached over and gripped Keanu's hand tightly. It wasn't the performance. It was the feeling that love in all its forms could still find air to breathe. Afterward, a teacher approached them. "We don't get people like you here," she said with a smile. "But you stayed through the whole thing. That says more than any donation ever could." Keanu smiled back. "Sometimes staying is the most radical thing you can do." Back in their hotel room that night, Sandra took out an old box she had brought from LA. It was filled with photos, journals, little fragments of her life she hadn't touched in years. She handed Keanu a Polaroid, one from the set of the lake house, where they were both laughing, drenched in rain, makeup running. "That day," she said, "I remember thinking, if I ever fall in love, I want it to feel like this." Keanu studied the photo, then looked at her. "It does." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her tears did. That night, for the first time, they slept in each other's arms with no walls left between them. No old fears, no looming headlines, just warmth, just presence, just a promise, unspoken but understood.